This morning I'm going to play the role of Margaret Sichelo. Margaret was to be our lector this morning and somewhat at the last minute called me and is not well. And so I dutifully picked up the adult lector book, and I thought, it's a short scripture, I can pull this off. Here then the reading from Mark chapter 4, beginning at verse 35. That evening, Jesus suggested that they'd cross over to the other side of the lake. With Jesus already in the boat, they left the crowd behind and set sail along with a few other boats that followed. As they sailed, a storm formed. The winds whipped up huge waves that broke over the bow, filling the boat with so much water that even the experienced sailors among them were sure that they were going to sink. Jesus was back in the stern of the boat, sound asleep on a cushion, when the disciples shook him awake. Shouting over the storm, they cried, "Jesus, Master, don't you care that we're going to die?" Jesus got up, shouted some words into the wind, and commanded the waves. "That's enough," Jesus said. "Be still." And immediately, the wind died down to nothing, and the waves stopped. Then Jesus turned to the disciples. "How can you be so afraid? After all you've seen, where is your faith?" The disciples were still afraid, but slowly were coming to grips with what they had seen. They said to one another, "Who is this Jesus? How can it be that he has power over even the wind and the waves?" Hear what the Spirit is saying through these ancient words of Scripture. Thanks be to God. So I'm going to be shameless for just 2 seconds, I promise, but because it relates. You probably read this in First Word anyway, but I am very proud and very excited that Woodlake Books has just published what we think is going to be the first in a series of Bible study books that I have written, and got released this week. And the first one, nothing like starting with a storm, we started with the book of Revelation. So that'll be interesting to see how the world responds. Well, okay, we're a small publishing outfit in British Columbia, so it won't be how the world responds, it'll be how a few dozen respond. But anyway, years ago when I started writing Bible studies, someone challenged me. And they challenged me not personally, but they challenged me because of the tradition that I'm a part of. I was then with the United Church of Christ, which is pretty similar to the United Church of Canada. And they said, "How can you write Bible studies? You don't take the Bible seriously." And I said, "I do. I take the Bible very seriously. And we do in our church. We always take the Bible seriously, but," and this was the rub, I said, "I don't take it literally." And that was a problem for this person. So I thought about it, and I continued the conversation with them a little later, and I used this morning's scripture reading to illustrate taking the Bible literally versus taking it metaphorically. To take this story literally is absolutely okay. And this is a good story. And even taking it literally, it's got some good news in it. To take this Bible story literally, and we have to be careful because we're so used to people saying they're taking a story literally when they're absolutely not. We've got to be careful. If we take this story literally, what it tells me is, if I find myself on a boat in the Sea of Galilee, and there's a big bad storm, and Jesus is physically sleeping at the back of the boat at the stern, if I ask him to, he'll stop the storm, and I'll survive. Now that is very good news, except the odds of me being on a boat in a storm on the Sea of Galilee with Jesus physically asleep on the same boat are microscopic at best. They really are. So it's good news, but it's very, very limited. And taking it literally, that's what that story gives us. But when we take a biblical story as metaphor, as something bigger than what is there on the page, it has all sorts of wonderful power, all sorts of wonderful meanings for us. And I want to share just a few that over the years I've experienced from this story. But I can only experience them if I take the step beyond the literal story. One of them is, and I don't mind being on big boats, I'll be honest. I'm not keen on small boats. My father was keen on small boats. I grew up beside the ocean. He thought nothing of going out on his day off, regardless of the weather, in a 14-foot aluminum boat, which when you go out in the ocean and it's stormy, that boat seems even smaller. And 14 feet isn't that big to begin with. Maybe that's what turned me off of being out in small boats. I don't know. But I have been in a lot of storms in my life that didn't involve boats. I've had a lot of those days when I think, ah! Or words to that effect. Perhaps you can relate. Those times when I thought, I have way too much to deal with. I don't know how to approach such and such. I can't believe this is going on. I can't believe what I have to do. Why is this happening to me? That's probably the most common storm, isn't it? Why is this happening to me? And in the midst of those storms, if I pause for a moment and call on Christ, which does actually involve stopping for a moment, that's sometimes the hard part, right? We're so convinced that we have to solve everything, we don't stop. But if I stop focusing on the storm long enough to call on Jesus Christ, it's amazing how that storm can go away. It's kind of like the other day I was speaking with someone who is dealing with some big changes in their life, and they were feeling a little bit overwhelmed by them. And I was trying to empathize with them, and I remembered the Asian proverb about eating an elephant. Do you know how to eat an elephant? One piece at a time, exactly. One bite at a time. Elephants are big, but you can get through it one bite at a time. I've never actually eaten an elephant. I just wanted that disclaimer out there. But it does make sense, doesn't it? Often what Jesus simply tells me when I am panicking and focusing on the storm is that if I slow down, somehow I can get through it. And the other good news that comes to me with that is Jesus is with me in that process. It's a lot easier to get through the whole elephant when you know that God is with you. Another piece that I really like about this one, and this one involves knowing a little bit of context, has to do with the fact that the Jewish people hated water. Not drinking water. They lived in the desert after all. They knew that they needed water to drink and to live on. But they didn't like the ocean or lakes very much. Even today, interesting statistic, you can learn anything from the internet, whether it's true or not. But interesting statistic that of all of the nations in the world that have oceanfront, Israel has the fewest number of pleasure boats per capita. I was fascinated with that. I thought, so they still hate the ocean. The ocean's full of all sorts of big, evil, horrible creatures, they thought, for centuries. And if you went out on the ocean, one of those creatures would probably eat you. If nothing else, one of those big creatures might come up like an Ogopogo and knock your boat over. That's why some of us don't go out on Okanagan Lake, because we know. And on lakes, even though they were smaller than the ocean and didn't have storms quite as much as the ocean seemed to have, they had enough storms that they were worth avoiding. You would go out on them to fish because they needed to do that to get food, but you didn't go out there for fun. That was just pushing your luck. They did not like being on the water because of storms. So knowing that, I read this story And it tells me that even the most threatening thing out there, a turbulent ocean or lake, is nothing to Jesus. Jesus just gets up and tells it to stop, and it stops. If Jesus can stop a storm on a lake, this story can tell us, Jesus can certainly handle anything we might be facing, whether it's in our own lives or whether it's because we made the mistake of turning on the news. Someone asked me the other day, is the world getting better or worse? And I had to pause. Usually I don't pause. Usually I'm able to say, it's getting better. Sometimes really slowly, but it is. But I did pause the other day. But then I remembered this story, and that was very helpful to remember this story that tells me that no matter what is going on out there in the world around, Jesus is stronger. Jesus is bigger. Jesus has the power to calm down the worst of storms. The last piece that I found in this story that speaks loudly to me, and there are many other things in this story that I'm sure will speak to you, but the last one that I have often turned to this scripture for the reminder of is that I can get angry with God. And that's good news. That might sound a little strange. But I think it's good to know that we can get angry with God and God can take it. Right? When you read this story, no matter what a translation has tried to do to make it nice, the reality is the Greek points out very clearly the disciples are not happy when they go to Jesus. And the question they ask him is basically, don't you care that we're going to drown? It's very much a 2-year-old's question, isn't it? You know, Mommy, don't you care that, or if you loved me, you would. Often there's, candy involved in the rest of that sentence. But it's that kind of a question. It's a very childish question, if you will. Because, of course, Jesus cares if they were going to drown. But instead of just saying, Jesus, by the way, could you wake up now? There's a bit of wind. They don't do that. Jesus, don't you care we're going to drown? I've had those times. I've had those times when I've talked to God and the conversation has begun with words not quite as polite as this, but basically, God, I am really ticked off with you right now. And maybe you've had those times too. There are those moments when I want answers and God does not seem very forthcoming. I want to know what's going on. And I get silence. I can get really upset with God. But I also do find through that if I'm upset with God, it doesn't mean I'm questioning God's existence. It means I just want answers. And I'm not getting them on my timetable. And what I love in this story is when they yell at Jesus this way, notice what Jesus does. He does not get up, point a finger at them and say, you horrible idiots. How dare you ask me a rude question like that? Just for that, I'm going to make you drown. That's kind of, thing you get often in cartoons and stuff. It's not the biblical story. The biblical story is Jesus gets up, calms the storm, and then turns around and in a much nicer voice than the disciples had says, did you have a problem? Was there something going on? I don't see any storm. How come you don't get it, is Jesus' question. And it's written in a way that implies that it's a much gentler question than the disciples. There are those times, hopefully they don't happen often, but they do happen. Let's face it, they happen to all of us. There are those times when we get angry with God. And sometimes we feel guilty about that. And worse still, sometimes people are eager to help us feel guilty about that. And I think that's just dumb. Because I think it's perfectly natural sometimes to get angry with God. But this story reminds me that when I do, God can take it. And God does take it. And God will wait for me to throw my little hissy fit. And then God will say, okay, let's start eating that elephant. Let's move through the storm. So many wonderful things in this biblical story. So many wonderful truths. I wouldn't for one microsecond want to reduce any part of the Bible to just being something literal, when there is so much that it can give us each day. Thanks be to God.